Great. So, welcome everybody to the NERI's post-budget analysis seminar. This is our first seminar since the first quarter of 2020. So we're back in a way, and welcome back. This will be the first of what we hope will be monthly seminars, perhaps even more often, given that they're easier to do now in many respects. And we're very lucky today to have three excellent speakers. We've Tricia Keilthy, who is the head of social justice and policy at St. Vincent de Paul and is an adjunct professor at UCD. We've Eamon Murphy, who is an economist and social analyst at Social Justice Ireland and sometime lecturer in Maynooth University. And we have Michael Taft, who is a researcher for SIPTU and blogger with notes on the front. So each speaker will speak for 15 minutes, and after every session, we will then open it up to questions and answers. So the way we will do this is that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you open that up and type in your question, I'll be sure to voice it after the presentation, and that will allow us to open up a bit of a discussion with the presenter. So our first presenter today will be Tricia. And Tricia, do you want to begin? Thanks very much.
Can you see my screen there?
We can indeed.
Great. Thanks very much, Tom, and thank you to NERI for inviting me here this afternoon to present the Society of St. Vincent de Paul's analysis of Budget 2021. I suppose just before we start on the actual analysis, I thought it would be useful just to give context for the budget in terms of how we frame the analysis, but also in terms of how we approach our the budgetary process every year in terms of our key asks. I suppose it's important to note that prior to COVID, there was almost 700,000 people living below the poverty line, including 200,000 children, and 270,000 people were living in consistent poverty, which is the sharpest form of poverty, and one of the ones that includes both low income and experiencing enforced deprivation. I suppose it's important to note also that between 2014 and 2018, there was a fall in consistent poverty from about 9% to 5.6%. But during that time, calls have remained high to the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, and things like the cost of living, which particularly the cost of childcare, the cost of education, the cost of utilities, and particularly housing has driven financial hardship among low-income households, particularly in recent years. And I suppose the latest data from the CSO shows that enforced deprivation was actually increasing in 2019 at a time when unemployment was very low and the economy was doing well. So in terms of particularly cost of living and the impact that has on people in poverty combined with a low income has been to the fore in our work more recently. I suppose up to September this year, we've received almost 80,000 requests for assistance, and we're coming into the busiest time of year. But if we look at trends over time, we see a 15% increase in our calls in September compared to September 2019. And I suppose during the pandemic, we would have seen the importance of the speed at which the pandemic unemployment payment was administered, the decision to have a ban on evictions, the moratorium on utility disconnections, which ended at the end of June, all were very important in mitigating the worst financial impacts on people on low incomes. But now we're seeing, as those were removed, those protections were removed in recent weeks, our calls are up, particularly in relation to utility arrears, people struggling with their rent. And I suppose some of those measures are now being reintroduced as we head into level 5 this evening, which is important. But we are very concerned about the future prospect, and that was kind of framing our analysis coming up to the budget. And I suppose it's not, the research has really shown that COVID has disproportionately impacted those on the lowest incomes, not just those who have experienced job losses, but also people who are on fixed and low incomes prior to the pandemic as well. So when we're assessing the impact of the budget, we tend to have 3 questions that frame our analysis. The first is, will the budget reduce poverty and inequality? The second is, will the budget improve the lives and living standards of people living in poverty? And the third is, will the budget provide investment in key services that will support people to move out of poverty for good? So I'm just going to take those three questions and go through the budget in terms of what was delivered and what wasn't delivered in terms of those three key questions. So in terms of the first question, I suppose we can't underestimate the importance of the pandemic unemployment payment and the temporary wage subsidy scheme in protecting and cushioning households from the impact of COVID-related job losses. And the ESRI have demonstrated that this has prevented a dramatic increase in poverty as a result. But I suppose there is key questions in terms of what happens in spring when those schemes are due to come to an end, if they do come to an end, in terms of the level of the payment, the targeting of the payment to particularly young people, but also low-income families as well who've been impacted by job losses. And the second question in terms of how poverty will be impacted in 2021 is whether or not there is a sufficient focus in government policy on the issue of household debt. And I suppose we were disappointed that there was nothing really in the budget to deal with this issue, and it's something that we see emerging in the next couple of weeks and months as a major issue, particularly in terms of utilities, as I've mentioned, also rent arrears and also mortgage arrears as well. So we'd hope that there would have been a comprehensive package maybe in terms of particularly rent arrears, because there is supports there for tenants and the eviction ban is back in place, but there's no mechanism there to help people who may be in arrears on their rent. I suppose it's also important to recognise the available resources that were there were directed at those on the lowest income. So we saw a welcome increase in the living alone allowance. So that is now set at a rate of €19 a week. And we know that people, and older people in particular, living alone are particularly at risk of poverty and income inadequacy. And we are also welcoming of the increase in the qualified child payment. So there is two rates of payment, and this is based on the research from the Vincentian Partnership for Social Justice, which shows that the cost of raising a teenager is significantly higher than that of raising a child under 12. So they had advocated for many years that the social protection system would be reflective of this. So that was introduced in Budget 2019, and they've begun to increase payments for children over 12 since then. But I suppose it's important to say that there's still a gap between social welfare income for children and also the cost of raising a child. The gap for a teenager stands at about €40 every week. So people and parents are forced to cut back and go into debt as a result of that. The fuel allowance increased again, which is very welcome. It's still not where it was in terms of 2010 levels. If you take account of energy price increases, it hasn't returned to the purchasing parity power of 2010, but an increase is welcome. It has been positioned in the last two budgets as a way of offsetting carbon tax increases, which works well for maybe older people living alone. 70% of recipients of the fuel allowance are older people, but for example, 40% of children in receipt of a qualified payment aren't in households that receive the fuel allowance. So it's very means tested, so it doesn't reach everybody that's impacted by a carbon tax increase. Improvements in the working family payment for households up to 3 children. And there was also some removal of the cliff edge earnings for the one parent family payment. Up to this, if you were earning more than €425, you lost all entitlement to the one parent family payment and secondary benefits as well. So they're all really welcome. And I suppose given COVID related response, there was a need to support businesses, support household incomes, which left very little scope then to address income inadequacy in households that were already experiencing poverty. And I suppose the greatest disappointment with budget 2021 from our perspective is the decision to freeze core social welfare rates at a rate of 203. We had hoped, given the pandemic had shed a light on the inadequacy of social welfare and by virtue of the government recognising this by introducing a higher rate of PUP payment, we'd hoped that this was an opportunity to address the inadequacy of social welfare and move on that. But I suppose more generally in terms of the distributional impact of the budget, if we see core social welfare rates remaining as they are and the national minimum wage increasing by 1%, if we see wages increase by more than that, or by 2 or 4% next year, and median incomes increase faster than those on the lowest incomes, we're going to see an increase in the at-risk of poverty rate, unfortunately. I suppose in relation to the next question, it's important again to recognise the important role social transfers play in reducing the at-risk of poverty rate from about 40% to 14%, but it leaves people, many people, particularly those in working age, in receipt of working age payments, living below what is required to meet a minimum standard of living. And we know that the deepest level of inadequacy for households headed by single adults and households with children persist. So while there was some increases for households with children, it wasn't at the level that was needed to address the very deep levels of inadequacy for people who are their only income is from social welfare. So even if we do test against inflation, I suppose it's important to recognise that people still are on an inadequate income, even if it does adjust for inflation, depending on what happens next year. So the Department of Finance forecast a 0.4% increase in inflation in 2021 on the headline, and then core inflation is projected at 0.2%. And that's important to pull out because core inflation doesn't include energy and unprocessed food, so fresh food, because they're highly volatile. And if you look at research both here and in the UK, there is this issue of what in the UK they term poverty inflation. The fact that low-income households face higher than average rates of inflation during times when the costs of essentials such as food and energy are rising faster than headline inflation. So in 2021, if it is a no-deal Brexit, that will impact particularly on the standard of living of households on low incomes, which could wipe out any gains low-income households have made from budget and welfare increases. We know from research from the SRI, which was carried out in 2018, that price increases will be 70%, impact households at a 70% higher rate than those on higher incomes. So we can see maybe the erosion of living standards among people on low incomes at a higher rate than those on medium or higher incomes. The other important thing to recognise in terms of assessing living standards and the budget is that during COVID, we've seen that higher income households have been able to increase their savings. The ability to work from home is primarily among people who are in higher income households, so they haven't had a loss of income. But low income households may have lost income, or they may already have been on a very low income and they're already in debt and cutting back on basics. So we're likely to see, again, a disparity and a growing gap in living standards between high and low incomes as well. And the fact that the budget did not include provisions to address debt will only further exacerbate that, unfortunately. So as I mentioned, the fuel allowance increase is very means tested. So not everybody affected by carbon tax increase, not all low-income households, should I say, affected by carbon tax increases are compensated. But even if you look at the overall increase is about €98 extra next year. But if you take average gas usage and also factor in the public service levy, which is applied to all electricity bills, which increased by 130% this year, that will average out at about €120 per year for average gas and electricity bills. So people will be worse off as a result. And it's also important to factor in, particularly when it comes to the carbon tax, the energy efficiency of homes and the appliances that people on low incomes have, in that they may have to use more energy to achieve an adequate level of warmth in their home because they are more likely to be living in energy inefficient housing as well. Then the third factor, should I say, in relation to living standards is, unfortunately, what happens in budget is that if there is increases in social welfare, the national minimum wage, often thresholds and means tests for secondary supports are not always adjusted. So what happens nearly every year is that a person may receive an increase in their social welfare payment, but a lot of that may be taken away by the fact that their differential rent has increased, whether they're in social housing or in payment. Also, the thresholds for the National Childcare Scheme, if they're not adjusted, people may lose entitlement to the higher rate of subsidy. Also, the medical card thresholds haven't changed since 2005, and not always the back to school allowance thresholds are changed, so people also may lose entitlement to that. So there might be a net gain in their income, but they may lose entitlements to other secondary supports, which they then have to pay out of their own pocket, which has a negative impact on their disposable income. So just then, in relation to the third question, in terms of services, I suppose there was welcome progress in the area of energy efficiency. We saw 65 million euro allocation for the retrofit of social housing, which is very welcome, because that is one of the most straightforward ways that you can address both energy poverty and also tackle climate change. So that was really welcome from our point of view, and something that we've been calling for a long time. And I suppose, but there is questions about the ambition and adequacy of that. The 65 million should allow the retrofit of about 2,500 social homes, but we know that about 30% of the social housing stock is more than 40 years old, which means that's about 40,000 units. So we need to be doing a lot more every year and a lot more funding to actually ensure that all local authority housing is up to standard. And there was also important investment in the Warmer Home Scheme, which is a good option for low-income households who own their own home as well. Again, it was welcome to see an allocation and a budget line for the implementation of Sláinte Care, and also the 38 million for mental health services. And we also welcomed the commitment to end direct provision and to provide additional funding this year to improve living conditions in the interim. We know the Catherine Day's report is being published today, so we hope that this particular commitment can be advanced over the next couple of budgets. I suppose it's also important to say that there was no change to the daily allowance for people in direct provision, which we were disappointed about as well. There was some progress in relation to the adequacy of SUSI, in that particularly for postgraduate students in terms of changes to the thresholds. But we're disappointed that there was no moves to address the grant adequacy in itself, or address the issue of non-adjacent grants, which disproportionately impacts students living in rural areas. And also there was no provision made to open up SUSI to part-time students. So part-time study is often a good option for lone parents in particular, or people with disabilities. But at the moment you cannot access SUSI support if you're studying part-time. But the Minister has committed to review this in next year, so that's to be welcomed. Social and affordable housing, there's obviously extra funding for more build of social housing, which is welcome, but given the scale of the housing crisis, the number of people on the housing list and in emergency accommodation, we would have liked to have seen more ambition in this regard. In terms of cost rental, it was welcome that there is funding for 400 units of cost rental accommodation. And I suppose important to us is that ensuring that affordability is central to the design of that programme, in that people aren't paying more than 30% of their income on housing costs in that particular model. And there was also more money for inspections of private rented accommodation, which is really important, but there was no commitment in relation to advancing the strategy to implement minimum energy standards in the private rented sector, because we know minimum thermal efficiency in the private rented sector is very low, and people in energy poverty are more likely to live in the private rented sector as well. I suppose in terms of the areas that there was little or no progress, there was nothing in relation to the cost of education, or for measures to tackle educational disadvantage, which again has come to the fore during the pandemic. And we saw, particularly the impact of the digital divide on children in disadvantaged areas and schools. There was nothing, it seems, in terms of rural transport, which is a big barrier for people on low incomes in rural areas in terms of getting to work, getting to school and supermarket, and just trying to connect in the community as well. Very little in terms of childcare, the National Childcare Scheme, both in terms of the resourcing for staff to ensure that they all have a decent wage and decent paying conditions, but also that the subsidies are targeting those on the lowest incomes. There's certain gaps in the way the scheme operates at the moment, which means that low income households can be worse off than they were on older schemes. And also there was nothing in relation to community energy advisors, something that we think it would be a good way of tackling both climate change and energy poverty as well. I'm running out of time, so I would just briefly like to say we sometimes in our analysis, you can get caught up in the numbers, and we like to use case studies to show the impact, the real impact the budget has on people who have sought assistance from SVP. I know the slides will go up on the website afterwards, so people might like to read them more in depth afterwards, but this is just an example of a lone parent who has recently moved out of emergency accommodation. And I suppose just to say also, a lot of the time, the distributional impact of policy changes don't take into account the poverty premium. That means the extra people on low incomes pay for goods and services by virtue of being on a low income. So for example, high cost credit, the ability to pay by direct debit, all those add to extra costs that people don't realise, and that makes it more difficult to make ends meet as well. So that's just a case study of a lone parent, and this is a 2-parent family in a rural area as well with 4 children who actually benefited, didn't have any benefit from this budget as well. So I won't go into detail here on those, but they are to read if people are interested. So I suppose just to conclude, this budget was unprecedented in the history of the state. It was a huge amount of resources put into supporting businesses, supporting household incomes, which were all really important, but it left very little scope to address poverty and address issues that the pandemic had shone a light on in terms of structural inequalities in our society. So from our point of view, you know, we would have liked to have seen upfront spending on ways to address poverty in terms of income supports and also services that low income people rely on. Because every year the state spends about 4.5 million dealing with the consequences of poverty on people's lives. So spending now could have reduced expenditure in the future, making up for that, the ways poverty impacts people and the problems it causes. So from our point of view, we would have liked to have seen a greater emphasis on this issue. So that's me. Anyway, happy to take any questions.
So thank you very much, Tricia. That was an excellent presentation and very, very interesting indeed. An excellent analysis. Just to say, we do have a few questions. The first one is, will the slides be going up? And yes, the presentations will be made available on the website shortly. And we'll also publish a recording of today's seminar, which will be on our YouTube channel. Now, my NERI colleague, Kieran Nugent, asks, he states, Eamon Murphy recently put the cost of deep retrofitting the social housing stock at about 2 billion. Meaning at the rate announced 65 million this year, it will take approximately 35 years. Multiple policy returns in terms of energy poverty, cost of living, labour intensive could reduce health system costs, respiratory illness and climate targets. There doesn't seem to be a long-term strategy in the budget, particularly on the environment where the IMF are recommending every country does so. It's important to push the idea, he says, that investments in future resilience and sustainability of our economy are not costs. He makes the point a lot of commentary has been on splurge, giveaway, etc. He thinks that framing is unhelpful in the context of an emergency budget. So his question then is, would you regard this as a giveaway budget?
Well, it just in terms of the social housing retrofit piece as well, I think there is huge questions over what the unit cost of a deep retrofit of a house is. So I think the department put the 65 million would do 2,500 homes, but that may be overly ambitious in terms of the actual cost of that. In terms of, was it a giveaway budget? No, I don't think so. I don't think there's such thing as a giveaway budget, because for people on low incomes, they certainly didn't benefit in the way that they should have, given the deep levels of income inadequacy. And again, the longer term costs of poverty to not only the individual, but to wider society are well documented in the report that Micheál Collins carried out for us last year. So we would see it as an investment, investing in people's incomes and protecting people from the damage poverty causes. And that can't be underestimated.
And just another question from Paul Goldrick-Kelly. What is the scale of spending that Vincent de Paul would have liked to have seen in the budget? And then just from myself, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about the best way forward in terms of the pandemic unemployment payment. What do you think is the best strategy to pursue there? And then finally, what are your views on the carbon tax? Are you supportive of it in general, or are you supportive of it contingent upon it being complemented by income supporting policies? And then I suppose if I have a final question, it would be what did you make of the ESRI analysis that low income households fared best in budget 2021?
Okay, so the first question was in terms of the scale that we would have liked. I suppose just if you take the social welfare budget, obviously that's the biggest spending budget in government, and already social transfers lift a huge proportion of people out of poverty. And I suppose our ask in that area is to benchmark social welfare rates against the cost of an MESL, or the minimum essential standard of living. So if you did that, that would bring the baseline rate of 203 up to 245. That would be adequate to meet the minimum needs of a single adult who is in receipt of rent supplement. So we obviously don't expect that kind of investment over one budget, but we would have liked to have seen a longer term strategy in terms of how government would achieve social welfare increases at that level, and progressively realise that over a number of budgets. Even if you index linked social welfare payments to wages, you would be talking about 1.2 billion investment. But again, that is an investment that you pay back, or you receive back, in terms of not spending on how poverty damages people's lives. So prevention is better than cure from our point of view. But there was loads of smaller measures that the government could have taken that would make a real difference. For example, the cost of genuinely free primary and secondary education is estimated 200 million. It's not a small figure, but it's not a huge figure in terms of the impact that would have. And I suppose then other areas, that obviously the housing is a huge area, and we would have liked to have seen even the HAP limits increased in line with market rent, just as a preventative measure in terms of people becoming homeless, because it costs the state 34,000 every year to provide someone with emergency accommodation. So there's always a trade-off between the upfront spending that you need to prevent further spending in the future. The second question was in relation to the carbon tax, or was there a missing?
Yeah.
I suppose the Department of Finance had a consultation 2 years ago on the carbon tax, and they set out a number of options. And at that time, our position was invest in rural transport, invest in energy efficiency schemes, prior to increasing carbon taxes, so that the alternatives are in place for people before you increase those costs to households, which disproportionately impact low-income households. When they took the decision then to set out a trajectory for the carbon tax, our position then was you need to make sure you increase core social welfare rates or tax credits or adjust it. So making sure that particularly people who are in low paid work benefit in some way in terms of carbon recycling. And we were very clear that the fuel allowance was not the appropriate mechanism to offset the carbon tax. and that seems to be how it's been positioned in the last two budgets. And then in terms of the ESRI analysis, certainly, as we mentioned, the resources that were there went to people on the lowest incomes. But there's two questions in terms of what you measure that against next year. So as I outlined, if wages increase, you're going to see a growing gap between those on the lowest incomes and those on median and high incomes. And the second is there's a big question mark over what happens to inflation and how that will impact people on the lowest incomes. If Brexit disproportionately increases prices in relation to food and energy, people on the lowest incomes will absorb more of that, and they'll have a higher than average rate of inflation. That will erode their living standards and maybe any gains in terms of social welfare increases, unfortunately.
Thank you again, Tricia. That's very, very comprehensive, and we might have an opportunity to speak with you again before the end. But just in the interest of time, I'm going to move on now to our second presenter, Eamon Murphy from Social Justice Ireland. Social Justice Ireland, of course, every year produce with incredible speed an excellent analysis of the budget, and they certainly do great work over there. So, Eamon, if you want to take it away.
Thanks, Tom. Just to make sure, check first of all, you can hear me and that...
We can. I can, certainly.
And you're seeing my slides and not my notes, is that right?
I can see just your slides and I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, thanks, Tom. So just, to reiterate what Tom said about our 24-page budget analysis that we do every year. If you're interested in reading more of our analysis, you can check out socialjustice.ie. You can download the analysis document for free, or you can watch the hour-long launch seminar where we discuss some of the content. And naturally, that's what I'm about to talk about here today, or what I'm about to talk about here today is drawn from that document. So I'll begin by saying credit where it's due. The government got a lot right in Budget 2021. I think the most important aspect of most budgets, and certainly the most important aspect of this one, given the context, was always going to be the fiscal stance. Would government try to minimise the deficit, as has been the orthodoxy whenever an Irish government is faced by constrained finances, or would it do what every sensible commentator and group was advising them to do, and to give a counter-cyclical boost to the economy and to the society that that economy serves? So for all the talk about how this was by far the biggest budget in the history of the state, and it was that, that was absolutely the appropriate thing to do. Government, broadly speaking, got this one right. There's a couple of aspects I'd quibble with, but it is a counter-cyclical budget, which we strongly welcome. And it shows that we aren't making the mistakes of 12 years ago when the economy was crying out for a boost, and yet the prevailing orthodoxy was spending cuts and austerity. I think actions that it's now acknowledged destroyed public services, did a huge amount of damage to the most vulnerable in our society, and produced far higher unemployment than would have been necessary. Admittedly, the circumstances are wholly different this time around, not least the fact that borrowing is historically cheap, and this economic downturn is not part of the business cycle. It's a very unique set of events that are kind of unseen in modern economic history. But still, like, the broad economic goal, I think, for this government for the time being should be to ignore, to a great extent, the short-term implications of what's happening. I'm referring to things like the growth in the national debt, the huge deficit, how that deficit to national income ratio has grown substantially. And we need to look at this as a situation to be managed over several years, maybe even several decades. Competent management of what we're doing now, whatever phase you want to call this now, ultimately it'll minimize the long-term economic damage. It'll preserve much more productive capacity in the economy than if opposing actions were taken, and minimize the overall fiscal adjustment for the long term. I think less important than the absolute level of debt is the ratio of that debt to the size of the economy and to the cost of servicing it. And last year, the national debt, or interest on the national debt, cost us €4.5 billion. Next year, that'll be €3.5 billion. That's been falling for several years now. So cheap borrowing for investment always makes good fiscal sense, and it makes sense now more so than ever. But I don't want to spend all my presentation congratulating the government, as well as being, they got one very big thing very much right. They got from our point of view, one big thing very much wrong. And Tricia dealt with this in great detail, so I won't double up too much on the analysis. But we strongly regret the fact that for the second year in a row, welfare recipients are being left behind. Yes, there were some targeted increases, things like the living alone allowance, the qualified child payments, the fuel allowance, but core welfare rates were ignored for the second year in a row. And we know that unless welfare rates keep pace with earnings growth, the most vulnerable in society eventually get left behind. Earnings have been growing impressively the last few years. In the last 4 years, they've grown by about 16%. And in advance of Budget 2021, we were calling on government to commit to benchmarking core welfare rates at 27.5% of average weekly earnings, and then to move that rate in the direction of the minimum essential standard of living, the MESL, as is produced by the BPSJ. Government didn't do that, and the result is simply that we believe that when the CSO produce silk numbers for 2020 and 2021, we're almost certain, as certain as we can be, that we're going to see increases in poverty. And I suppose even more so than saying that's regrettable, it's not really acceptable. Some other things that we would welcome in the budget, and this is not by any stretch a complete list now, but I just wanted to pull out a few pieces that we're broadly in favour of. The increase in capital expenditure in 2021 compared with this year, despite the constrained public finances, shows that at least government gets the need for it. During the last recession, capital expenditure suffered huge cuts. It was slashed, and we're still paying for those cuts now. So at least that isn't happening in 2021. The carbon tax increase was something that we're broadly in favour of. Now, Tricia's pointed out that it's likely not enough is being done to compensate many of the people who really need to be supported in response to it. And I've got nothing really to add, I guess, to her analysis of that situation. It's very much true. But from an environmental perspective, this was kind of a positive, and so too is the fact that future increases in the carbon tax have been included in the finance bill. So what that really means is that we're not going to hear any more announcements about it in future budget speeches. It's just going to happen automatically. The increase in home care hours of 5 million a year, I think that brings it up to 19 million. And also the increase in primary care funding of 150 million euros shows us moving away from the, well, gradually, I suppose, very gradually moving away from the sort of hospital-centric approach that our healthcare system has been characterized by. And that's also very positive. So too is the additional funding in education. I think there's an additional close to 1,000 SNA places, 400 special needs teaching posts, and over 600 additional ordinary teaching posts. But to put some context on that, those things are very much positives when we compare them to how we've done in the past. But we still remain one of the countries with the highest pupil to teacher ratio in the EU and the OECD. The vast majority of the additional spend that's going on health in 2021 is COVID related. So in that regard, this is very much a reactionary budget. The aim is to keep us more or less where we were a year or so ago. There's no moving forward. There's still no ring-fenced funding for Sláintecare, which is a model of healthcare reform that's now sitting on the shelf for 3.5 years. And Tricia talked about already the extent to which nothing was really done to tackle overall educational disadvantage. So really, I kind of see a lot of what's been done in the budget in relation to education is to keep us kind of, given the intervention of COVID, to keep us on a footing where we were maybe a year or so ago. We're very positive about the additional 10,000 upskilling and reskilling opportunities that have been announced through Solus and SkillNet. And there's an extra 4,000 apprenticeship places as well. 1,500 of them are going to relate to retrofitting related activities, which ties in very much with our climate goals. And that's a big positive. And as well, we're strongly positive on the maintenance and increase to the overseas development aid budget. This was very welcome. We would be insisting that now it's very important, not at this particular time, not to abandon the most vulnerable people in the world. Well, the challenges that Ireland faces are obviously very significant. They do pale in comparison to those faced by people living in the developed, or a bigger part in the developing world. So the ODA budget was seen as sort of an easy thing to cut in the early part of the last decade. we're glad that its importance has been acknowledged, and that was maintained and then increased for 2021 by 30 million euros. And Tricia's already mentioned the improvements or the funding for the improvement in the direct provision situation, albeit without any increase to the payments. And that's all really I was going to say about that. Tricia has covered that already. And just a kind of list of some of the bigger disappointments outside of the lack of change to the welfare rates. Government has kind of shown that in some respects lessons have been learned from the past, and that in other ways they're maintaining sort of mistakes of the past, maintaining kind of old orthodoxies. I think the cut in the VAT rate for the hospitality sector will, as it did previously, kind of really just benefit mainly the larger businesses that have the largest sales and therefore least need of it. It's kind of worth, I think it's worth pointing out that these businesses really need cash as opposed to reduced VAT on sales that aren't really happening. And it's not as if the sales aren't happening because prices aren't competitive. It's because people either can't or won't go out and risk catching a virus that might kill them. So this is using sort of a demand side response to tackle what's a supply issue. I think a cut in VAT isn't going to make people go out to restaurants more, certainly not over the next 6 weeks, or take more weekend breaks. It's positive that it's time limited this time, but we'd like to see better targeted supports for that sector. I think a VAT cut for an entire industry is a very blunt instrument and is really going to just reproduce the problems of the past that ourselves and I think many of the other attendees in the virtual room today campaigned against. We were delighted to see removed in budget 2019. And the other one kind of that it's similar in that it's a demand side response to a supply issue is Help to Buy. I mean, all the evidence suggests that, and this was sort of reiterated by Barra Rowantree at the SRI in their budget response seminar last Friday. A substantial proportion of that money is going to people who already have a deposit and don't need it. So a majority of the money is actually going to people in the upper part of the income distribution. They're really the only ones who can afford to buy the houses for the prices they're being sold at. So, given all of this, and given that government must know it at this stage because we're not the only organisation who's been talking about it, I can only assume that the purpose of the policy is to make the direct recipients feel that they're getting something from government. The longer term implications for the housing market, though, are that essentially developers now know buyers have extra tens of thousands of euros in their pocket that they otherwise wouldn't, and developers can now factor that into asking prices, and that's going to simply serve to lock in higher prices over the long term. I know of nobody outside of estate agents and developers and this particular government who think it's a good idea. And just to refer very quickly to some other kind of disappointing areas, a couple of months ago, well, probably a little bit longer ago now than a couple of months, but there was a report commissioned that showed as a result of COVID, there was a funding deficit within the community and voluntary sector of close to €500 million. Now, of course, we never expected government to address that entirely. I think the overall supports for the sector, when added up, amount to around €30 million. At least that's the figure I was seeing from the wheel. So it seems that whereas all the talk, the community and voluntary sector has been lauded throughout the pandemic for the services that it's been providing, it seems that when it comes to putting one's money where one's mouth is, unfortunately, the community and voluntary sector is not being kind of looked after to the same extent as some other sectors. And there's still no ring-fenced funding for Sláinte Care. We've been calling for the last few years for an extra €500 million in the health budget dedicated solely to this over a 6-year period to get us where we need to be in relation to this. Tricia has already addressed concerns around lack of movement on childcare, which is sort of stunning in a way, given how important that particular sector was shown to be by the pandemic. And as well, regard the cost of living for people at the bottom of the income distribution, there's been no movement towards a living wage. Well, I suppose a 10-cent movement towards the living wage, despite the fact that this was included in the programme for government. There's been no mention of a cost of disability allowance, despite some very welcome boosts in funding for the disability sector within the health budget. So overall, we're kind of positive about a lot of the budget. In large part, we're asking, whether there's where's the vision really. A lot of the programme for government looked very good. There was talk of creating a new social contract, and I think we're at a time where we seem to have broad public desire for a new way of doing things, a new paradigm. We've got the relaxation of the Stability and Growth Pact. You've got historically low borrowing rates. So I'd question whether this was sort of an opportunity missed in some respects, or are we allowing COVID to distract us from the long-term vision, like we did with Brexit before that, like we did something else before that. I think of some of the media that I was consuming in the run-up to the budget in the few weeks prior to it. I think in particular of listening to Tom McDonald talking about the possibility of borrowing an awful lot of money at the low rates that Ireland can avail of at the moment, and using that to fund a sovereign wealth fund, locking in that cheap borrowing now and holding on to it for the next few years for when we need it. And a lot of money needs to be spent over the next decade. But instead, I talked about, maybe the government has moved away in some respects from economic orthodoxy, but instead of doing something like that, we ended up spending the rainy day fund. And ostensibly that was fine because it's clearly raining quite heavily, but you'd wonder why the need was felt to spend that money now, given that it was presumably invested, making a return for itself. Why not instead fund that €1.5 billion by borrowing at potentially negative interest rates? So overall as well, we would say that there was sort of little, and I wasn't expecting any big tax moves in this budget, but there was little acknowledgement within any of the context or the speeches of the need to, in the long term, medium to long term, to broaden our tax base, to increase revenue into the future in order to close the close the public services deficits, the social infrastructure deficits that exist between Ireland and our peer countries of the European Union. That's something that needs to be acknowledged. We can't, we're not going to close those gaps by doing what we've been doing in the past. I just see I'm just coming to 15 minutes. So what I'm going to do is just conclude on one final point, which is in relation to this. Now, this is something that I like to show off anytime I'm asked to speak in response to any budget. And the reason I'm just kind of quietly fitting it in here at the end is because not only was there no change to income tax rates and bans in this budget, but there wasn't even any talk of doing so ahead of the budget. But yet at the same time, Fine Gael do seem to have sort of a minor obsession with promising to cut income taxes for its assumed voter base. And I think it's useful to contextualize that for people. So what we see here are trends in effective income tax rates going back just over a decade. This is for a single earner on 25 grand, a couple with one earner on 40 grand, and a couple with two earners on 60. So as you can see there, yes, they do pay more in tax, PRSI and USC, than they did at the beginning of the last downturn. But people's memories are short. This is the trend. I'll just show you now in a moment the trend for the same group going back to 1997. So basically, over the last 12 years, we've seen there's a bit of an increase during the downturn, and now we're kind of they came back down again, those effective rates, but they're still higher than they were 12 years ago. Going back to 1997, here's what they look like. So I kind of urge people to have a bit of an understanding of the context here. There's a lot of talk about the need to alter the bans to get rid of the USC because it's crucifying people. The income tax system is not perfect, but everybody is getting a far better deal on it now than they did within living memory of presumably most or all of us in the room. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Eamon. That was excellent. As well, a lot that I would agree with, obviously, just as I would with Tricia. And I was taken by a number of things that you said, which I'll get to in a minute. I do have a few questions. The first one you've kind of dealt with already, which was your opinion on the cut in VAT for hospitality. Will it work, and what will the likely effect be? I think you've pretty much covered that, to be fair. It was a bad idea. It won't be as ineffective, as I understand it from your point of view, as maybe dealing with some of the fixed costs. Dealing with some of those issues will obviously disproportionately benefit businesses that are actually selling goods, and therefore is badly targeted as well. But obviously you may want to have more additions to that. So just to
in relation to that as well, just the one other thing I'd add to it is the reason we were part of the reason we campaigned against it 2 years ago, or just 2.5 years ago, was we were wondering whether these are the sorts of industries with low paid employment that we should be supporting, and whether or not there was was a better use of what at the time was about €500 million rather than to be subsidising low-paid employment. I think you've spoken yourself before, Tom, about the need to move away from that kind of model of an economy and to move towards higher quality, better value-added employment, I suppose. But yeah.
And I know it's certainly something that the Irish Congress of Trade Unions have vociferously campaigned against as well. And I think generally it was a poor move. So some of the other questions then, first of all, do you think that the increase in the national minimum wage, which as you know was about 1%, 10 cents, was appropriate? Was it too high? Was it too low? Also, does Social Justice Ireland have a position on the current nature of the property tax? And then just to give you a third question, VAT and PAYE are the biggest contributors to the state's revenue. VAT traditionally was slightly higher, but since the financial crash, PAYE is now the largest contributor. And the question is, will this ever be corrected? And how did this budget impact on that balance? So a lot for you there, Eamon.
Sure. Was to begin with the national minimum wage, the 10-cent increase. So we're looking at it in the context of what does government want to do in relation to this? And ostensibly what they want to do is to equalise the national minimum wage and the living wage over a 5-year term of government. And that's what they want to do. Then, while it may have been convenient for them to accept the recommendation of the Low Pay Commission, I know not everybody, I should definitely say not everybody on that commission was in agreement with that recommendation. It was kind of convenient for them to be able to do that in this particular budget, and maybe there's a desire not to cause too much upheaval in the market at the moment. But if you're going to close the gap between a minimum wage, which is now $10.20 an hour, and a living wage, which is now $12.30 an hour, it needs to be at a greater pace than 10 cents per hour per budget. I would also say as well that we're very much of the opinion that closing the gap between the minimum wage and the living wage should not be solely the responsibility of employers, that government can do and should do an awful lot in order to reduce the cost of living for low paid people, basically by investing in things like our housing infrastructure, healthcare, transport and childcare in particular. But employers also have a role to play, and I think in this context, maybe 10 cents was a little bit stingy, to say the least. In relation to our opinions on the property tax, it's becoming kind of a bigger joke as time goes on, as the government fails to sort of rejig the bands. People may or may not be aware that the system of property tax that we have, I'll begin that again. People may or not be aware that in the United Kingdom, the bans for local property tax or their equivalent of it haven't been touched since the 1990s. So if you think it's bad that we're waiting now, I think is it 6 or 7 years? Somebody might be able to correct me there, for the bans to be changed to acknowledge the fact that house prices have changed so much over the last few years. The longer this gets left, the more of a political minefield it becomes, the less likely a Minister for Finance is likely to tinker with it. And this problem could have been avoided in the first place had we instead designed a site value tax, which I think is a much more efficient way of raising money without discouraging people from, for example, investing in the building or whatever it is that's on the particular land that they have. And I suppose if people want to learn a bit more about what we think of site value taxes, socialjustice.ie, just type in site value tax. We've got 2 long articles on it, on how we would see that being designed and why it's a preferable model for a property tax than the current local property tax design. And the final thing was in relation to VAT and PAYE. To be honest, off the top of my head, I don't have the numbers in front of me, so I'm not sure whether to any great extent Budget 2021 is going to change the balance of the different areas of revenue raising, whether it's going to change it in any significant way. And as regards whether it's going to be corrected over time, I suppose we would be of the opinion that, well, I guess broadly speaking, when we're certainly not calling for any tax reductions at this particular time, because the trajectory of the next few years needs to be upwards in our revenue raising, we would be pretty okay with seeing reductions to VAT rates, which generally speaking impacts lower paid or people, lower socioeconomic groups more than higher ones, and to see a greater a reduction as well on the reliance of income tax. We're not ideologically tied to any particular way of taxing income. We would be fine with seeing lower paid people paying higher amounts of income tax, but first we want to see them getting the well-funded public services that would allow them to reduce the cost of living in other areas. But I suppose it's a case of looking at what the incremental changes in each budget are going to do to individuals, and ensuring that we don't make low-paid people worse off than they are already. I think the way to do that really is by giving any income tax decreases through the credit system rather than by tinkering with the bands, which, the way it's been proposed anyway by one of the governing parties, would seem to inevitably lead to the better off people receiving most or all of the benefit.
Thanks, Eamon. I just have one more question for you. Does Eamon think that the income tax bands graph should be discussed in conjunction with similar trends in costs of living from 1997 to give a more accurate reflection of household budgets?
I think there's no harm, and the more information that's there, the better idea people have of what's actually going on. But I suppose the purpose of the effective tax rates chart is really to show, I mean, I guess it's the area that we feel most represents or is the most important representation of the effect of changes in PRSI, income tax, and USC over time. So other pieces of information are kind of, yes, by all means, let's have a conversation about them. But I think that the effective tax rates chart does give a very good idea of what the actual, if you want to call it the burden of taxation, that falls in different groups.
Eamon, thanks very much. We might have another opportunity to speak at the end, but for time reasons, I'll need to go into thank you again, Eamon. And Michael, if you want to start your presentation, go for it. Michael, you might need to unmute.
Okay.
Gotcha.
That's great. Thanks very much. I'll just head on in. Aidan Regan posed a question in the Business Post last Sunday. He asked whether the budget was simply an emergency response to a public health crisis, or is the beginning of a paradigm shift for the role of the state in the economy. Now, he suggested that the signals coming from the government is that it's an emergency response and nothing more, and the objective is to consolidate as soon as possible. I think that Aidan's pessimism was a bit like, excuse me, Schrodinger's cat. As long as you don't look at it, the budget is in this kind of state of quantum superposition, where it is both forward-looking and backward-looking at the same time, because it's clouded by just a ton of cash that's being handed out. So everyone can project their own hopes and preferences onto it because of this flux. However, when you look into the box, reality collapses into one state. So let's take a look at the box, some parts of the box. First off, public investment. Now, we all know that we're going to need a substantial, significant, and long-term public investment drive, not only to engage in post-pandemic repair, to deal with Brexit, climate change, automation, and AI, and the threat of a long-term, low-growth productivity economy as we become an aging society. And that doesn't even count the infrastructural deficits we carried into the crisis. However, Budget 2021 gave no indication that the government is aware of this need for such a drive. Public investment increased by only 600 million euros, though there's a bit of a stat war about, how you compare that between non-COVID related investment and NDP projections. But set that against what the Fiscal Council had suggested, which was that the government should engage in a 10 billion euro 3-year program of stimulus driven by public investment. So we can see that there's no indication that this is the start of anything significant or long-term. If we look at another part of the box, at stakeholder democracy. Stakeholder engagement is all the rage now, at least on paper. What problem is that stakeholder engagement can mean anything you want. It should mean that all those with a stake in the outcome of economic and social policies should be part of the decision-making process that creates those policies. That's why you got that democracy bit. But in the minister's two budgets, there was no reference to social dialogue, no reference to stakeholder engagement or stakeholder anything, or any other type of democratic participation in recovery strategies. Not even a gesture, not even as a sop. The fact is that if you were to look at this budget, it would appear that it's so employer-focused that workers and civil society are reduced to passive agents in the recovery. Looking at another part of the box, the welfare corporate state, or the corporate welfare state. Now, of course, the government is rolling out an enormous amount of public subsidy to businesses to maintain the productive economy. We have the COVID restriction support scheme and other wage subsidy schemes. We have vouchers, we have grants, we have guarantees, we have capital schemes, loan schemes, and actually it just runs off the page. And that's only just column one. We have all these things being thrown at the business sector. Will some of them work? Yes, some won't. Given the unprecedented nature of the crisis, efficiency can be the enemy of urgency. But there are some subsidies that are categorically inefficient and wasteful. The Help to Buy scheme and the cuts in VAT. And I'm not going to say anything more because I think Eamon covered that very well in his presentation. What this calls for in terms of the corporate welfare state is a new theory of the interdependence of the public, of the private and the public. One thing this pandemic has done is it has obliterated the distinction between the public and private economic spheres. This should lead us to a new corporate governance regimes that are based on rights and responsibilities, requiring enterprises to act according to democratically determined standards in return for assistance in commercially difficult situations. Very similar, actually, to job seekers' payments being dependent on the recipient looking for work or participating in education schemes. Some of those democratically determined standards could be a respect agenda, whereby you respect the right of workers to engage in collective bargaining, the reduction in carbon footprint, and any environmentally damaging activities the enterprise might engage in, things like the gender pay gap and the wage dispersion to reduce inequality. Whatever it is, we shouldn't go back to the days when hospitality employers took billions in VAT cut subsidies after the last crash, boycotted the Joint Labor Committee, and suppressed wages and working conditions. So that's one of the main lessons that we should be drawing coming out of the pandemic, to transform enterprises into social agencies operating within commercial and stakeholder mandates. Now, of course, people are wondering, okay, that's this year and next year and the year after that. How will we, though, reduce the deficit and the debt? Now, in the budget papers, the government stated that most of the debt will be reduced through recovery and growth. In fact, they say that economic recovery will likely do most of the lifting. Now, at the beginning of the crisis, the government and the Fiscal Council estimated that most of the deficit would be driven by a fall in tax revenue. That's kind of the standard treatment of what happens in an economy when it enters into recession. So therefore, the recovery in public finances would be largely driven by revenue returning to trend as employment increases and economic activity increases. However, it's different this time. The overwhelming majority of the deficit has been driven by expenditure increases. Revenue hasn't fallen to the extent that was being projected. Therefore, we could see that the heavy lifting in terms of fiscal recovery could fall on the expenditure side. Now, This doesn't necessarily mean it's a return to austerity of old, like we saw in the last crash, where the minister stands up once a year and says, we're cutting this amount out of public services, that amount out of social protection, and that amount of investment. But what we could experience is austerity below the radar, whereby the value of public spending is squeezed in the context of rising population. And let me give you just one example. And this example comes from the pre-pandemic projections from Budget 2020, because they projected the spending on public services out to 2024, 5-year period. So as you see, there was an increase in about 10% on public services expenditure over the 5-year period to 2024, about 4 billion euros extra. Not much, but at least it's an increase. However, when you factor in inflation, all of a sudden you see that public services expenditure falls from a nominal nearly 10% down to 2%. That's the impact of the value of that spending. And then when you put that through spending per capita, because public services are dependent on how many people you are in society, you have a growth in elderly people, growth in young people, and just a general growth in the population. So when you do that factoring in inflation and then do it on a per capita basis, we see that actually spending on public services will fall by 3%. That means that public spending and social protection and or investment could get squeezed in terms of the value and per capita. So that's something we have to look out for. Now, SIPTU put forward a couple of weeks ago, published its progressive fiscal framework as a starting point for trade unionists and civil society activists to focus debate on an expansionary fiscal policy over the medium term. And in short, it proposed rejection of a balanced budget ideology, a public investment drive that is based on borrowing. Again, as Eamon pointed out, the prospect of borrowing at negative interest rates gives us the ability to borrow well above what we need in 1 year and warehouse that debt, lock in that low interest debt for years to come so that we can continue in the borrowing drive over the medium term. A revenue strategy based on increasing employers' PRSI over the long term and shifting taxation more and more onto capital stocks like assets and wealth and capital income, and a democratic participation of the producers in the productive process. That's also known as the working class. This is not the final word, it's a starting point for discussion. It will be all the more needed when the government lays out their medium-term projections next spring. And it can save us from a lot of nonsense commentary that we've had in the run-up to this budget. I mean, you get this phrase, we're all Keynesians now. Oh my. It's this misguided notion that somehow the more you spend and the more you borrow and the more deficits that you get yourself into, the more Keynesian you are. This is just twaddle. Was the bailout of Anglo-Irish somehow Keynesian? I mean, let's bottom line this from actually what Keynes said. When we all believe that economic investment should be socialized because the capitalist class can't be trusted to invest over a long horizon, when we all believe that the rentier class should be euthanized because they are a drain on the productive economy, when we all believe the government should engineer a permanent quasi boom rather than some Goldilocks porridge too hot, porridge too cold, counter-cyclical simplicity, when we all believe that, then we can say we are all Keynesians, not just for now, but for the long term. So 3 challenges that we can look at in the short term. First off, the recovery fund. The government has established a 3.4 billion euro recovery fund to stimulate increased domestic demand and employment. Now, a lot of this money is going to be needed to top up enterprise and household supports for the level 5 lockdown, which the budget didn't envisage. But we can still use that money to engage in a very targeted way on public services. I would suggest childcare. Prior to the pandemic, the government was already subsidizing early years services by nearly 70%. the amount of subsidy, yet we is childcare and some of the so it was operated.
Okay, Michael, Michael seems to have been knocked out of the discussion for now. Hopefully it's just a minor broadband issue and he'll be back. Here he is, in fact.
I'm sorry about that. Jeez.
No problem at all. Do you want to keep going, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, where did I mess up?
Well, you started to crackle out, so maybe just go back to your previous slide or the slide that you were on.
Is the slide up?
No, it's not. Childcare was the middle bullet point.
Okay, I don't know that I can get the slide up again.
That's okay. Don't worry about it. You can just talk to it, Michael.
Yeah, I'll talk to it.
Okay.
Anyway, I mentioned the fact of the subsidies to the childcare sector. It's probably nearly 100% with the temporary wage subsidy scheme. So therefore, investment from the recovery fund into the childcare sector would cost very little extra. This is something that we could, there could be a lot of cooperation among opposition parties and civil society groups to actually transform that sector. The second challenge would be the National Economic Plan. We can begin the debate on a new corporate governance regime. We could also intervene at the sectoral level because the program for government committed to establishing task forces in each particular sector with government, independent experts and stakeholders to focus on those specific needs because many sectors will be impacted by the pandemic, but also Brexit, climate change, automation, long-term low growth. We're looking at things like hospitality, physical retail, transport, food production, especially beef production, financial services, etc. So this could become a stepping stone towards a more fully developed workplace democracy strategies coupled with popular sectoral planning. The final challenge would be for trade unionists and civil society groups to start right now to actually put together a new dispensation in social protection and social security, bringing together the need for enhanced in-work benefits and a living income for everyone. I mean, the things like mandatory sick pay schemes, income-related unemployment payments, along with generous family benefits should be linked to guaranteed income floors based on, for instance, the minimum essential standard of living as produced by the Vincentian Partnership. This could transform our social protection system away from poverty amelioration and into a true protection system for the social. And the government's Commission on Taxation and Welfare is an excellent space for that progressive cooperation. So finally, to conclude, it's not enough to critique government policies. It's not enough to oppose government policies. So we need to do those things. There must be a transformative leap from being an opposition to becoming a government in waiting. This is not something that just political parties do. This is an all of civil society undertaking, encompassing trade unions, civil society groups, community organizations, researchers and scholars, and all those who want to contribute to a new way of doing things. Doesn't mean complete agreement or unanimity on all issues. In fact, that could be a selling point. Progressives can show that they host the sites where the most energetic and innovative debates occur. But it does call for commitment to the historic task of building a government in waiting. As the great political theorist put it, before a social class takes power, they must act like they have power. Thank you.
All right, Michael. Excellent as always. Thanks very much for that. I have a couple of questions from the the floor, and then I have a couple myself. First of all, from my colleague Lisa Wilson. Given that the first lockdown and the closure of childcare in schools showed the absolute vital public infrastructure role which our childcare sector provides, she's disappointed that it has been ignored by the government in the budget, but she's also despondent at the lack of criticism by those who have been publicly analysing the budget in the media, etc. So she wants to know what you think needs to be done to get some proper policy momentum behind the issue, or even an appetite to see childcare as part of our core public infrastructures. Additional questions? Eric Conroy wants to know, does Michael have anything to say about the biggest issue of our time, climate change? And Ono Mahoney wants to know, does Michael have a view on how civil society organisations can best prepare for such a government in waiting? Okay, Michael, 3 easy ones for you there.
Okay, well, in terms of the childcare, there is a due early in the new year, a report due from it's called the Panel of International Experts, very high-sounding title, which is supposed to be putting forward a new funding model. I think at this stage, it's incumbent upon those civil society groups that are in first instance involved in childcare to put together what they see as a funding model. Because one of the problems with childcare is not just the level of funding going into it, which is not enough, but it's also the mechanism by which that funding is going through. As I said, pre-pandemic, 70% of the earlier services were already being publicly subsidized. There's something flawed about the way the money is being channeled into. Now, I know that Big Start, which is the organization of childcare workers who are members of SIPTU, will be intervening in this debate. But you know what we have to do in the
You're fading out again, then, there, Michael. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, well, Michael's obviously having a little bit of broadband issues at the moment. So I was wondering, I might bring the question on climate change back to Eamon and Tricia, and just obviously in terms of the areas that you look at, what do you see as the priorities for government and society at large on that issue at the moment? And do you have concerns in terms of potential impacts on low-income households and concerns around just transition principles, for example? Michael, I see you're back. Obviously, if you want to jump in on that issue again as well.
I didn't actually hear it. I always just came in, so just work away.
Eamon, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, Michael's president recently said not to worry too much, that things were going to start getting cooler soon, and to trust him on that. So in the unlikely chance that Donald Trump is incorrect about that, I guess from the environmental perspective, I would say that this particular budget contains an awful lot of positives. There's kind of talk beforehand amongst political commentators that the Green Party's finger is needed to be on this one for political economy reasons. But I guess the focus on reskilling opportunities and retrofitting, as I said, was a good move. We were pleased with the carbon tax, the fact that this will now automatically happen every year, the fact that some of that is going to be used for ring-fenced funding. But overall, I guess we were disappointed with the lack of talk specifically about the term just transition, which doesn't seem to have made it far enough yet into the lexicon of this particular government. And realistically speaking, where there was some positives there, I think that overall we're being distracted in part by Brexit, in part by COVID, and ignoring what's really the key challenge that this government and the next government probably is going to face over the subsequent 10 years. What's most important is not only just that we take the necessary action, but we do what needs to be done to protect vulnerable people. Tricia is probably more of an expert than I on this area in relation to, she was talking about how the fuel allowance wasn't going to be enough, and I'll leave that to her to expand on. But also to make sure that there's reskilling opportunities there for people whose communities and industries are going to be negatively affected by this. It's not enough just to leave them, that they entered particular careers and they built communities around particular industries, because for decades and maybe even centuries that was considered by society to be a socially necessary thing, and there was no problem with it. We can't just change the model now and expect them to kind of deal with it by themselves. So I think it's really important that they get that just transition aspect of it correct.
Tricia, do you want to make a brief comment on the climate change issue and just transition?
Yeah, I suppose, you know, we have been in the space of energy poverty for a long time, and you know, if we're going to meet the climate change targets, we need to be much more ambitious in terms of the retrofit piece, and rural transport are the two big major issues that are not only needed to address climate change, but also to make sure that low-income households are able to access alternatives and are able to be part of that change as well. The big challenge is for private rented sector, and how you ensure that energy efficiency upgrades are not offset by higher rents, and how that plays off with each other, and ensuring that landlord incentives are balanced with landlord obligations in terms of standards in that regard. But I think in terms of the carbon tax, you know, we focus on income supports as offsetting it. And I suppose our concern would be that, like what happened in this budget, people are pretty much back to where they were. Life kind of stands still. They're not maybe necessarily worse off. Some may be because they don't qualify for the fuel allowance. But then it means that wider policy goals around poverty reduction and improving income adequacy are not addressed. So one thing in terms of the climate action bill, I know there is question mark over whether the targets are legally binding, or is it just that the government have to strive to reach those targets. But there is something to learn in terms of, could we have a similar poverty act in that targets are set down in legislation and government have to reach that, so that those broader goals are not forgotten. And then the other piece that we've been looking at more in depth is because the PSO levy and the carbon tax are going to increase, which is going to impact people on low incomes. And we tend not to focus on the cost, the unit cost. Other countries have things like social tariffs or price caps. So as we move to more renewable sources of energy and more options for low income households, that's another way to build in protections if there was a government subsidy to subsidise the tariff and the unit cost rate for people on low incomes.
Michael, do you want to get back to Lisa's question about childcare and how we make it part of our core public infrastructure, and indeed getting momentum behind it as an issue?
Yes, and again, apologies for my poor connection here. Well, I don't know how much of the last thing was recorded, but to make it part of our core public service infrastructure, we have to make it part of the core public debate. There will be a report early in the new year from so-called international panel of experts. Those organizations which are involved in the childcare
Michael, unfortunately, is having a lot of problems with the broadband there. But just to reiterate again that everyone's slides will be up on the website, and I know that the piece that Michael is talking about is to be published in, I believe, January, which will set out a framework for the childcare sector, although that would suggest that there is perhaps a small sliver of time left in terms of influencing that. And I guess then I might just give one last opportunity. We've only 5-6 minutes left. One last opportunity for Eamon and Tricia if they want to make some kind of final comments on the budget, or indeed where they think policy should move in the next few years, and also if they want to highlight any of their own events perhaps that are coming up. Eamon?
I suppose to begin, before I forget about the event, the annual Social Justice Ireland Social Policy Conference will take place next month on November 18th, as is required by the times we're living in, and will of course be online. So keep an eye out for information on that on ActiveLink. The information is actually available on our website at the moment as well. And speakers will include, we've got a couple of international speakers, including Anne Pettifor and Philippe Pouchet, I hope I pronounced that correctly, as well as Clodagh Harris, Joe Larraghy, Patricia King, Danny McCoy, and Karen Jaselski. I hope I'm not destroying that either, but they're some of the speakers that we have on, and more information about that is available on our website. But I suppose just to maybe make a concluding point, the way I would look at things in context, not just of this budget, but in future ones, is that, you know, there's four things happening right now, four key things. We've got, as I mentioned, historically low interest rates with borrowing costs never cheaper for Ireland. We've got unemployment that's high and we're experiencing an economic contraction. We've got significant deficits in our public services and infrastructure. And the fourth thing is that there's a clear need for us to restructure our economy kind of towards a more green and sustainable model, and to ensure that that transition is carried out in a fair and just way. There can never, and I do emphasize never, be a better time to borrow money to invest, to spend in capital investment. I'm hoping that this budget is not necessarily a sign that the government is going to miss a trick on that one, because for the long term, we do need to rejig our whole model and our whole way of, you know, the things Michael touched on about the role of the state in the economy. Fingers crossed that Aidan Regan is not being unduly pessimistic, and this is the beginning of a paradigm shift for Ireland.
Thanks, Eamon. Tricia, do you want to make one final point?
Just to say thank you for inviting me here today, and I suppose you know, from our point of view, the COVID pandemic has really shone a light on inequalities, and there was a sense of togetherness, and you know, some of that has dissipated in recent weeks, but I suppose it's just important to reflect and ensure that the issues of poverty and inequality aren't lost in kind of wider dealing with crisis, emergency, and running from one budget to the next. It's particularly, we need long-term thinking in this area. So you know, obviously we can't address poverty in one budget, but we definitely need to be thinking longer term in what needs to be done and how you do achieve that over the lifetime of this government anyway, at least. Thanks.
Tom, I think you need to unmute.
Unmuted. Michael, I was just asking, were there any final points you wanted to make? And I actually had a kind of just a question myself, which was what you felt was an appropriate level of infrastructure spend over the next 5 to 7 years. Obviously, there's going to be a lag associated with infrastructure spending and so on. Whether you wanted to comment upon that, or indeed any of the other points that have come up. Again, it's 4:30 in just 2 minutes time. So
okay, very quickly, and hopefully I can get through this without the thing cutting out again. I don't know that we can necessarily state what it is going to be over the decade. I think a good start would be Fiscal Council's kind of projected 10 billion euros over 3 years, and see where we go from that. But I would imagine we should see a number of repeats of that spend. And just very briefly to answer Owen's question, which I think is an important one, what can civil society activists do to kind of help create this government in waiting with the kind of progressive policies and perspective that we heard here today? I think one is that they can become agents of cooperation themselves, either as individuals or as organizations, working with all the progressive political parties. Because, you know, I don't need to tell anybody, there's a bit of rivalry, sometimes a little bit of sectarianism between that. It's important for civil society activists themselves to show the non-sectarian nature of their engagement. And secondly, for civil society organizations to start coming up with the common sense proposals, the common sense platforms that will actually not only win over progressive parties, but win over the public debate to basically what should be a common sense position.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Tricia, and thanks, Eamon. We're just coming up on time now. I'd like to thank you all for participating and for your excellent contributions. Again, they'll all be up on the website. This recording will also go up on YouTube, and we will publish details of our Donal Levin lecture and subsequent seminars. You'll find them up on the website. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next time.